Benedict Anderson, a scholar and intellectual of great integrity, died on the 13th of December 2015. Ben Anderson was best known for his work on nationalism, especially his book, Imagined Communities, that captured the imagination of large numbers of people in North America, in Europe, and most importantly, in Southeast Asia and Japan. Ben was a scholar of Indonesia and then extended his reach to the entire region and was in great demand, both as a speaker and lecturer, and also as someone who contributed to the politics and intellectual life of these countries. I recall him describing how when he was allowed to return to Indonesia for the first time after the long years of dictatorship and massacres, he spoke Bahasa, the language of Indonesia, and the reception in Jakarta was incredibly emotional. He is one of the few scholars of that region truly loved by the people he wrote about. And when he died in Java, something that one felt he had almost planned. And his funeral was an extremely emotional affair, with his ashes finally being thrown into the sea. This film that you're about to see, we made with Ben Anderson in the early 90s, a few years after the success of Imagined Communities. And though his views about his own work changed in the years, this is the freshest response of that period to what critics and others had been saying about Imagined Communities.
Politically, it was clear to me that a lot of the expectations that people who had been brought up in the Marxist or liberal traditions, that somehow nationalism was going to go away, was going to be superseded as we got more and more civilized. This was being shown to be quite clearly mistaken with the rise of Scottish nationalism, with the revived nationalisms in Eastern Europe, strong nationalisms in the Third World, and so forth. And it seemed to me this was against what everybody had expected. Nobody seemed to have a very good explanation. So I thought maybe why not to go back and reinvestigate why this was possible. Why did people feel so strongly about this that they were willing to lay down their lives for these funny things called nations? I decided to call my book Imagined Communities really for two reasons. One was that I wanted to find a word which was not imaginary, but also didn't imply somehow that it was real in a self-evident kind of way. I was also very much struck by the fact that most of the nations we know today, the people in them who feel loyal to them, in fact don't know who the vast majority of their fellow nationals are. They will never meet them, they don't know who their names are, and yet they feel this strange sort of abstract solidarity. And it's not even living people. The loyalties usually are to generations of dead people, and even more extraordinary, generations of people who have not yet been born. And this imagining of ghostly ancestors and even more ghostly descendants struck me as something really quite extraordinary.
Clearly we know that in terms of the kind of general presentation of Britain, often what's been presented to us is England. England and a notion of Englishness, whatever that is. I mean, I think it's difficult to grasp. But on the other hand, I think that there are particular moments when it's difficult to make any distinction between England and, say, the Celtic periphery that makes up the rest of the British Isles. And even the terms, like the British Isles seems to refer to the geographical area without any kind of social content or political content. And then Great Britain and the United Kingdom are heavily loaded political terms just in what they embody. We know that Great Britain is about England, Wales and Scotland and excludes the 6 counties in the north of Ireland, and that the United Kingdom is that area that includes that. And so they're weighted with a whole history.
British nationalism depends historically on the Bible, particularly on the Old Testament, that bound in with it there is a great deal of poetry and prophecy which comes out of the Old Testament, the identification with the Israelites, with a nation breaking out of Egypt and becoming sovereign. That's very much part of the British national imagination. In Ireland, nationalism historically has been bound up with Catholicism, and certainly many loyalists have taken the view over the years that it's an exclusive form of nationalism, that basically there is a concept of race and religion, which is part of it. I think that's undoubtedly true of traditional Irish nationalism, and you can argue equally well, I think, that British nationalism obviously is a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant construction, Bible-based and excluding other races.
I think almost all serious scholars agree that nations began to come into existence at the end of the 18th century. But all nations imagine themselves ancient. And this is a puzzle which it was part of my intention to try to explain how new things could be imagined so old.
After the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, which ensured the security of the Scottish kingdom for another 200 or 300 years, a document was sent to the Pope asserting the right of Scotland to govern itself. This is the, to us, famous document which says, as long as 100 of us are left, we shall not submit to the domination of the English. But also in the same document, there is a fabulous mythical history of Scotland embedded in it to justify this statement. And it's basically the Milesian legend saying the Scots came from the east, they tarried in Spain for a long time under a fierce people, and then eventually reached Ireland and the shores where they now live, and they have asserted their rights after totally obliterating the Picts. Well, all of this, of course, is just mythical history, and is remarkably similar in many ways to the constructs that more modern nations have made of their history.
The extraordinary thing about the English monarchy, of course, that it's never been English, at least not for 1,000 years or more. We have Normans who didn't speak any English. We have Tudors who were Welsh. We have Stuarts who were Scottish. We have the House of Orange, which sounds sort of cozy and Jaffa-ish, but actually, of course, is from Holland or Eastern Germany. We have Germans from Hanover and so forth. It's really rather an extraordinary story. One has to remember that, in fact, even the present House of Windsor was only called itself Windsor in this century. In the old days, nobody cared about the nationality of the monarch. The whole system of monarchy wasn't a nationalist system of legitimation. The whole idea of the royal family being representative in some way of the country means that it's got to be a sort of typical, or look like a fairly typical middle-class family. This again is relatively new, and it's not peculiarly English. You find it wherever the monarchies survive.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.
If you look at the sort of great imagined communities of an earlier age, these are the huge transcontinental brotherhoods of Islam, of Christianity, in a certain sense even of Judaism, Buddhism. These were much bigger actually than nations, and they were communities that oriented people towards the afterlife. You didn't think about where you came from, you thought about where you were headed. And you could go all over the world to a church or to a mosque or to a synagogue or to a Buddhist temple and feel that you were at home. With the decline of the sort of overarching power of these religions, then something, it seems to me, necessarily had to come to take its place. And I think that nations have come into being or have been imagined partly for that reason. One of the things that interested me about nationalism was the way it is clearly connected to changing senses of time in Europe and the Americas and later on in the rest of the world. The simplest way perhaps to explain this is to say that if you look at, for example, the Bible, or you look at medieval chronicles, what you find is that time is thought of as it were, under divine control. The function of a prophecy is to say that if a prophet says something, it's God's word, and eventually it will come true. And therefore, in a sense, the past and the future are all held together by something outside the time that we experienced, eternity, if you like. This time is linked to machinery, and this, of course, then becomes very important as the way in which factory discipline is arranged. People clock in, people clock out. So many things have to be produced within certain time frames. This is a sort of time which is very different from rural time, from seasonal time. And this is one of the ways in which the new kind of time imposed itself on broader and broader sectors of the population. The sign for this, I think, is the kind of novels or the kinds of literature that begin to be written in the 18th century, where for the first time you see events going on in different places at the same calendrical or clocked time, without the people in the novel necessarily knowing each other or meeting each other. That is, the reader has become God in a way, watching simultaneous events. You take, for example, the marvelous description of the Gordon riots in Barnaby Rudge. Dickens' prose allows you to wander, as it were, through the air across most of London.
In 2 hours, 36 fires were raging, 36 great conflagrations. Among them Borough Clink in Tooley Street, the King's Bench, the Fleet and the New Bridewell. In almost every street there was a battle, and in every quarter the muskets of the troops were heard above the shouts and tumult of the mob. The streets were now a dreadful spectacle.
The development of print technology is quite fundamental to the origins of nationalism as we know it. In the first place, I think one has to remember that the published book, which is an exact replica, each book is an exact replica of all the others bearing that title, is the first sort of consumer durable of modern society. And what it gave people when it began to appear, and there were already millions of books being produced within the first half century after the invention of printing, what it gave people was the feeling that there were lots of other people who they didn't know who had bought the same book, who were reading the same book with them. That is, it wasn't like manuscript reading. It was, as it were, mass-produced reading. And here is, I think, one of the seeds of nationalism as we know it. We get lots and lots of people reading in the same print language. Czechs read Czech newspapers, British don't read Czech newspapers, and vice versa. That is, the sort of the origins in some way of nationalism are precisely the fact that these huge reading publics come into existence, but these reading publics are territorially and linguistically bounded. And this, again, is a very important part of that sort of confidence, which is essential to making the imagined community of the nation real to people, profoundly real.
Our island, whatever the cost may be, we shall fight on beaches, landing grounds, in fields, in streets, and on the hills. We shall never surrender.
I think that you see nationalism typically becoming more visible. It's there all the time, but it becomes sort of politically salient under two kinds of conditions, I think. One, when there is in fact a genuine threat, which everybody in the nation recognizes is there. I think everybody in 1940 recognized that something very menacing was happening on the continent. And there you get this sort of deep sense of solidarity, of comradeship, which is an enormous source of strength. On the other hand, then there's sort of much more sort of bogus and factitious ones where state governments or regimes, for their own purposes, usually for some kind of raison d'etat, by using the levers of mass media, control of information, propaganda, can artificially stimulate this nationalism. And I think the Falklands War is an example of this clever, unprincipled manipulation.
Well, nationalism has so often been a cuss word. Good God, look back at the 30s and Hitler and all that. Nevertheless, it hasn't always been a cuss word. Take Italy, for example, in the mid-19th century, Mazzini, Garibaldi. That was a nationalism which one feels was not xenophobic, although naturally there was a bit of anti-Austrian feeling there had to be from a military point of view. Nevertheless, it wasn't xenophobic. It was part of a sort of revolution which was taking place there. Well, for me, Scottish nationhood, of which I'm proud, has been best expressed by the culture, by the poetry, the literature, and the music. Gaelic tradition, of course, the Gaelic song tradition, is what sells the Gaelic language itself. People learn the language because of its music and its song. So all these are things which you've got to put on the credit side of nationalism. And if I say nationalism, it is not the wrong word. People feel up to a point they've got to defend these things, you know. And that means an assertion of identity, which is a sort of nationalism.
If you were to compare British culture with the way in which, say, the Ulster Loyalists return again and again to certain dates, well, chiefly 1690, sometimes 1912, I think in the British historical imagination you do have something really equivalent, very, very fossilized. There are just a few figures, a few dates which are referred to. There's an uncritical acceptance of a sort of national heritage idea of history and a lack of interest in the complexity of British history.
The function of nationalist memory is to create seamlessness, where, in fact, the reality is extraordinary disjunctures, separations, and perhaps most important of all, dramatic changes of consciousness. But the story has to be told in a seamless way, and so things that are uncomfortable, that don't fit, tend to get set aside or reinterpreted to make them seamless. A good example of this would be the French Revolution, which everybody is now, that it's 200 years safely in the past, can be celebrated in a civic spirit in France. But in fact, of course, it was an extremely violent event which tore France apart for many generations. And so it's now being all reinterpreted as something cozy for everybody. So you can look at it and say, ah, yes, that's it. Let's have some postcards of it.
The ways in which, say, for example, monuments or places that seem to symbolise the very essence of the nation are like Trafalgar Square, are represented as completely benign places. There's never been no struggle around them at all. They never represent any contradictions. So that the massive, the 250,000 and up demonstrations that took place in the late 19th century in Trafalgar Square in support of Irish Home Rule are erased from history books and are therefore erased from any popular memory. The construction of the nation is also about the construction of a nation that is classless and doesn't have tremendous class conflict in its history. And I think that the ways in which the symbols of the nation are always about a struggle to construct one popular memory as against another.
If you were to take the cultural cringe factor in terms of Britain's view of the loyalists, that there is this detestation because it reminds so many British people of what they thought they'd put behind them or what they've suppressed under illusions of gentility and decency. So certainly that martial swagger historically has been to remind the nationalist population of their place. But I think it's very important to remember that what loyalism represents, what Orangeism represents, is a kind of parody of British imperialism. It uses certain imperialist insignia and it seeks to enshrine that imperial mission in certain images.
One of the sinister things about the empire was that it encouraged all kinds of sort of middle-class people to imagine themselves through race as belonging to a kind of world aristocracy, to play aristocrat off-center court, which is something which the aristocracy encouraged in order to shore up its own domestic position. The empire has a very complicated relationship to Englishness and to Great Britain. And this idea that the empire was multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic, stretched across the whole globe, couldn't really be accommodated within the idea of nationality as locale, as local memory, as English literature, as Stonehenge, and all those things. There was an enormous tension between the two. So you have these extraordinary educational efforts in India, in Malaya, and all around the globe, where local, usually upper-class local children, were trained, as it were, to act, think, as much as possible like English people, or middle-class or upper-class English people. But of course, the irony of all this was that you could train all these people to do this. And the logic would then say, well, if they really are Englishmen, there's no reason why they can't be cabinet ministers, they can't become Archbishop of Canterbury, or they can't, play important roles in England. But the English nation itself, of course, feeling quite national, wasn't going to tolerate this.
People came saying that they were coming to the mother country. Now, it seems to me that from the personal kind of anecdote I've heard, was that there was always a suspicion. Would it really be this mother that would be welcoming, because mothers anyway can sometimes reject you. But nevertheless they came. And they came, obviously, and there was a shock. I mean, I think there was a tremendous shock at the lack of welcome. Then, of course, we're born into that. It's a generation that's born into that unwelcome, born into that denial of our right to be of this land. And there's some continuity of experience, clearly. But I think what's fundamentally different is that for our parents, they always had another land to know in their memory. They always had another way of living that could be both a source of pain because they couldn't return to it, or perhaps didn't want to, and also, though, a sense of saying, it's okay, we can be. We don't only live in a place where all you see is white people who you are told are the very antithesis of you.
When one thinks about the difference between nationalism and racism, which seem to me to have completely different origins, in fact, you can tell them very quickly apart in the sense that all nations have on the books in one form or another a procedure which we call naturalization. It's not always easy. Some nations make it very difficult, but in fact all nations accept the idea that they can include people from the outside. Whereas the racist imagining is that one is eternally contaminated. One has a black ancestor, one has a Jewish ancestor somewhere. It's always going to be there in the blood and can never be escaped. And similarly, you can't sort of naturalize yourself as a white in the way that you can do it in terms of nationality.
Britain has surrendered, through joining the European community, certain areas of national sovereignty. In signing the Anglo-Irish Agreement, also surrendered certain areas of national sovereignty. There's no doubt about that. And that's seen as, I suppose, a gradual sort of rolling process which will create a different kind of reality where it's not that any citizen is absolutely one thing or the other, but which actually responds to the fact that all of us personally are mosaics of different bits and pieces of culture.
Well, if Scotland does achieve independence in Europe, as the slogan is, it will obviously make a big difference to the psychology of the Scottish nation. People will feel more able to be in command of their own affairs, which I think can only be a good thing. It might also be a very good thing for other parts of the United Kingdom, it seems to me, because over-centralization has been one of the grave faults, it seems to me, of the Westminster setup.
Who we are is very mixed up, and who we can be is open, doesn't have to be determined by some kind of preordained national history, you know, that will determine where we go from there.
It seems to me that nationalism is here to stay until there is some deep change in consciousness which would be parallel to the changes of consciousness that brought it into being in the beginning. At the end of the 18th century and early 19th century, a whole deep, deep way of thinking about the world and feeling the world, because nationalism is also feeling. If you could use the analogy of language, nationalism isn't really words. It isn't even really sentences. What it is grammar. It's syntax. It's what you think through. It's what you talk out of. And changing grammar, changing syntax is a very slow process and a very deep process.